Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. I'm delighted to have a guest who was recommended by an earlier guest we had on the podcast, Doug Field, OBE. And Doug, as a CEO, said, here is another CEO who I find personally very inspiring. He's got an OBE as well. He's also Deputy Lieutenant of Norfolk, a very interesting man, a professor in corporate leadership at the University of East Anglia, and just many things, many strings to his bows. And I've already had a thoroughly good couple of chats with him. Without further ado, I'll let him introduce himself.
Jonathan, really good to hear that introduction. I sort of like to keep my light under a bushel a bit, but I'm Andy Wood. I'm Chief Executive of Adnams. That's my day job. But through dint of circumstance, I've found myself doing a number of other things here in Norfolk and Suffolk, which are two counties which I love and want to see them grow and develop.
Well, it's fantastic. And for those who don't know, Andy, don't know Adnams, I mean, I am here, shock horror, I've given up alcohol. So it's not a big one for me, but I have had my moments over my military career where I've consumed my annual amount in about a day. But tell us about Adnams.
It's a business that was formed in 1872. It has a public listing, so it has the letters PLC after its name, but it is also, the majority shareholders are two families, two separate families, so they control about half the shares. So it's an interesting job being CEO of Adnams, because you need to deal with all the sort of paraphernalia that goes with the public listing, but also I can have a conversation with two large shareholders and talk about the direction of the company. And they've been alongside me for many years and have provided great stewardship during that time. We make beer, we distill spirits, both here in Southwold. And I have a product to fulfill your needs for beer, which is Ghost Ship 0.5, which is only 0.5 of alcohol, so it won't affect you bodily. Mm-hmm. And I hope you enjoy it if you get the chance to try it, Jonathan.
Thank you very much indeed, Andy. That's the most kind of you. And you're also chair of the Norse Group, which is a facilities management group, and there's 10,000 people in that. So you're always keeping your hand into what makes good leaders. And with that in mind, you and I were talking about, who would be a couple of other CEOs that you have found to be inspiring. And one of them is in the Norse Group. Would you just tell us a bit about him, and then somebody else who's a social entrepreneur?
Yes. So Justin Galliford, he's CEO of the Norse Group, a relatively young man in his first new CEO role. He was an internal appointment. He was somebody who grew up in the organization. And I'm a great believer in where there is talent, allowing that to flourish within organizations. And in what is a very complex organization, he's doing a great job. And he leads from a set of personal values, which I always admire. And then the second individual I would remark on is Craig Dearden Phillips. For different reasons, Craig is a social entrepreneur, spent a lot of time thinking about leadership, helping businesses spin themselves out from county councils or local authorities. At the moment, he's helping a business called HM Pasties in Manchester, which is employing prisoners as they come out of prison. They're employed in the pasty business, and that seems a really worthwhile thing to do. He's also quite a good sportsman, and he likes to do triathlons and things like that.
Wow.
So he's a good all-round sort of guy,
Yeah, sounds a heck of a guy. Having done a few triathlons myself, I must admit it does take an awful lot of drive and determination to do that. Are you a man who keeps yourself fit, Andy?
I do keep myself fit. I ride a bike. I try and run, and I do that for health reasons rather than competitive reasons. Now, at my stage of life, it's I need to be able to show up for friends and family and the people who rely on me here in the office.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for fitness for life. And there is no doubt about it. I was just having my hair cut earlier today, and the barber Scott Edgley, his brother Ross Edgley is the one who swam around the UK, and he just attempted another swimming record in a lake in Italy. But the lake was so warm, I think it was like 36 degrees, that the water temperature, it was like being in a very hot tub rather than a cool glacial lake fed from the Alps. But we were just talking about the importance of health, fitness, sleep, your blood work, and just keeping a record of that. I'm one who wears the Whoop strap, and then I've got an Aura ring as well. So I love and the Apple Watches. I'm really into recording stuff. You can overdo that. I am conscious of it. But what do you find that you enjoy? Let's stay on the health for a moment. We'll come back to the other
side. I particularly enjoy sort of Peter Attia. I don't know if you come.
I love Peter Attia. Yeah, and he just did a really good series. I've got to listen to the Scott said to me, he was with the Diary of a CEO.
That's right.
Yeah, and they did a really good double act. And
they did.
Protein and eating sufficient and muscle and weight training. What did you learn from that one?
Absolutely. So, and I've read his book recently called Outlive.
Yes, I have too.
Yeah. And really, there are two things that you need to be doing. Clearly, it's not going to guarantee longevity, but keep your VO2 max at a fairly high level. This is the amount of oxygen you can absorb and feed into your muscles, and lift weights as you get older, because fragility becomes a real problem. So those were two things that I knew of anyway. So my week really is, I particularly do something by 4x4x4, which is I do sort of 4 minutes steady, 4 minutes high intensity, and then I do that 4 times. And that has the most efficacy, if you look at some of the academic literature, on helping you maintain and improve your VO2 max. And I've started using kettlebells as well. But the other thing that you have to do is quite a lot of zone 2 work. And I just done a media ride because the Tour of Britain is coming through Suffolk. And I rode next to this young cyclist, Oliver Pratt, really lovely young man, 19 years old. And I said to him, talk me through your week. And basically it was some interval training with lots and lots of heart rate zone 2 work. Just building an endurance engine.
Yeah.
So that's a long way of answering that question. I mean, my view is I'm trying to think about health span rather than lifespan.
Yeah.
I want to be functional to a very old age if I can.
We share a similar view. I do want my health span to match my lifespan.
Indeed.
And like you, I've read a number of these books. I also like Dr. Mark Hyman and his podcast and his book.
The Doctor's Pharmacy.
The Doctor's Pharmacy, and then he did one all about longevity, which was his recent book. Have you read that one?
I have. The person who got me into this was I read a book called Finding Ultra. I don't know if you've read
I haven't come across that. Is it good?
That's by a guy called Rich Roll.
Okay.
And he's done something like 500 different podcasts now. And that's a story of a New York lawyer who had an alcohol problem, who turned his life around, basically. And ended up doing ultra marathons. Incredible story.
Yeah. Well, I'm thank you for that. If you recommend it, I will go and I hope it listen to it, because I'm dyslexic. So my medium is to listen or to do podcasts or listen to podcasts.
Yeah.
And it is interesting. One of the other very interesting leaders we had on was General James Bashall, Parachute Regiment.
Wow.
And James and I did airborne training and got our wings together on the same selection. And he is now, or recently was the Colonel Commandant of the Physical Training Corps. And I said, what do you learn from them, in your role? He said, well, interesting enough, I took out the Sergeant Major in charge of the Physical Training Corps, the senior soldier. And I said, what's your top tip for someone like me in my 60s? He said, beware inflammation. He said, yeah, tell me more. He said, you've had a life in airborne of running with packs, running, long distances. He said, really keep it down to about 5K, because when you start in your 60s to try and push out the distance, the ultras and things like that, which I've done, triathlons and mountain marathons. I hold a world record for one of the mountain marathons in Cyprus.
Wow.
But I did it when I was a young man. If I tried to do it now, I would get massive inflammation in my body. And inflammation is one of the problems and the things that ages us, as you know, from all your research. Wow. And there was another book, which is called The Health Revolution by Maria Boralius. And she's very interesting. She looks into all these different ways of how to reduce inflammation. Quite a good read, actually. But yes, I think the thing that in all our training, lifting weights is very good for us. Doing, as you say, a mixture of cycling and running, though a bit like you, I slightly overdid the cycling with a 500-kilometer cycle for Help for Heroes in northern France between all the battlefields. And I just had, what was it? The vomiting bug, whatever they call it, norovirus. And so my tank was completely empty when I went out there, and I did it. And, but everybody else seemed to find it so much easier than me. Maybe just they were fitter, I'm not sure. But there were some guys carrying huge beer bellies, ex-servicemen, who seemed to just storm up the hills, regardless of how much beer they'd consumed over the years. But yeah, I think it's a nice mix. Well, look, thank you for that. I really enjoyed that conversation. Let's talk about your own journey. I mean, not only that, but your fascination with leadership, being a practical man who tries to apply the theoretical and the reading. Just tell me a bit about the leader you are today and how the journey you got there, really.
Well, the journey is probably a path less traveled, but that's probably true for many people. Come from a pretty unpresupposing background in Southeast London in the 1960s. My father was quite prescient, I think, and thought I need to get my two teenage sons out of Southeast London and get them somewhere else where they can appreciate things other than living in, where we were at the time. And we moved to Norfolk and had I had an idyllic childhood in London, and that continued in my late teens in Norfolk. And then I went to work for the local organisation who was employing every suitably qualified young person at that time. I didn't go to university. And I went to work for this organisation called Norwich Union. I think I was there in the halcyon days, probably the decade before the people might have said that was the case. This place had everything going for it. It was a big business. It had its own sporting facilities. It had its own training school. And someone saw something in me, and they started to, try and shake me into something that could lead others. And, I had a 17-year career there, and I learned a lot about myself during that period. We did a lot of leadership training. We did a lot of understanding ourselves. We did something called David Kolb's Learning Styles Inventory, where I discovered that I was a very sort of activist learner, which, more senior you get, learning by trying things out isn't probably the best way to do everything. And it was from that point, in my early to mid-20s that I started to think about leadership and how I might develop my style over time. And I guess I'm a product today of those early conversations. I used to work for this wonderful lady who, you always knew when you'd done something wrong because Marion would put a book on your desk that you had to read. And woe betide if you didn't read it.
Wow. That's a really great way of going about it. And these formative years for anybody who's listening to this around the world, there's about 125 countries that leaders listen to. So it's a large slice of the world. they'll be interested in your experiences and what worked for you, because what worked for you and what worked for me is as different as our microbiomes. And that's the other thing. I'm sure you've done your study of that with Zoe. And
absolutely.
It's fascinating redoing my gut microbiome to see what's the good ones in there and the bad ones in there. But it is this point about each of us, our leadership style is unique to us. We can obviously, we're always learning from someone else.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I wouldn't even bother to do an inspiring leadership podcast, because you go, look, don't worry, just do your own thing. But there are some routes that people have trodden that help others. I still remember to this day when I was given the challenging task of taking a group of 30 staff college, very ambitious, jostling and pushing colleagues to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas City, Kansas, where we had to work with the Americans. And I was the chief of staff, the one in charge of all these ambitious leaders. And they were, to be honest, most of them far more talented than I am. They went on to become generals, and some were notorious, like Colonel Tim Collins, who did his speech on the eve of the Gulf War, which appeared on the president's wall. But the reason I mentioned this was that I was given an American general who'd been in the Vietnam War. And he sort of sat there in the corner in his sort of easy chair and watched me as chief of staff around the bird table, trying to, run the battle, simulated battle, which, funny enough, was over an Iraq-Iran kind of scenario with maneuver forces. Anyway, he said, Jonathan, let me give you some advice. He said, you haven't got enough time to make all the mistakes I've made. So let me tell you where the little bastards have buried all the mines out there, because you don't need to blow your foot off on the ones I've blown my foot off on. However, overnight, they've come out and put some more out there, which I don't know about those ones. You're going to have to experience that yourself, but at least don't feel that you have to make the same mistakes that I made. And I thought that was just such great mentoring, but also
very generous of him.
Yeah, very generous of him, and very humble. I think, as Robbie Williams said in his song, it's hard to be humble when you're so fucking big. And too many of those, you and I would talk about, too many of the senior leaders I come across are really rather pleased themselves. We wouldn't put someone as fine as Richard Dannett in that bracket, who you and I know. And who you are the Deputy Lord Lieutenant to Pippa Dannett, who is the Lord Lieutenant after Richard was. Very special couple there. But he has a lovely humility and humanity and a bit of a chuckling humor. I think you would have approved. He maybe didn't say Adnams, but when at the time, he managed to save the regiment as commanding officer, and the press then said to him, what are you going to do now, Colonel Dannett? He said, I think I'm going to go into the officers' mess and have a glass of warm ale. Which you always need to have that as a little advert to go. But it could have been an Adams one. But carry on with your story, because I think after 17 years and your activist style, what did you do then?
Well, so that led me to, supported by Norwich Union, to undertake a master's in business administration.
Wow.
Which I did, and that helped me become more reflective about my personal style and the way in which I was coming across, and led me then to think it would be really nice to work with an organization where I can make a real difference. That sounds cliched, but back in the mid-1990s, Adnams was quite a small business. And they advertised for someone to lead their logistics and customer service operation. And I came here. I found some very inspiring people here. My chairman, Jonathan Adnams, was working here, and there were some other very inspiring leaders. And for me, it's always been important to work for people that I respect. And these were a group of people that I respected. I guess I did a good job for them, because I got promoted, and in 2006 I became managing director and then chief executive a few years later. And it's been a wonderful journey that I've been on. And Adnams, from being a very regional business, is now distributed nationally throughout the UK and exports to 24 countries around the world. So, you know, it's made a step forward, and I hope I've made a contribution in its 150-year history. You know, it was a business that was formed in 1872. So it's been around a long while.
No, and it is interesting that you talk about, with pride, the history of an organization that goes back to 1872. And it's a great bonus, but at the same time, you have to make sure it doesn't become a rod for your back, where people go, oh no, we haven't done that round here, you know, no. We did that 10 years ago, it didn't work. And was it, I think it was Jack Welch, you'll probably know from your professorship, but who said when the speed of change on the inside is slower than the speed of change on the outside, the end is nigh. Yes. How do you manage with such a well-respected double family business to keep it current, keep it up to date? Because family businesses, and I've coached CEOs in a number of family businesses, both in this country and America, where it's quite hard, because they go, oh no, I don't like that change, and you can't do that. It's a challenge for you, so it needs special type of leadership.
It does. I think you have to. The conversation with the family members has to be made relevant to what's going on in the outside world. So Jack Welch was right. And, you know, the world is moving past us. So if we're not moving with it, we're going backwards, aren't we? And it really is, but important to keep an ongoing dialogue about the needs of the business now and in the future. And with my colleagues that I've worked with here, they've been very open to that. And I think they are bright individuals, and they've seen the benefits of an organization that is changing and developing. I mean, this business 20 years ago was doing some amazing stuff in the environmental space. So it built out at Raiden, 2.5 miles inland from here, a state-of-the-art distribution center made out of lime hemp block with a grass roof built 7 meters down in a disused gravel workings. When we closed the doors on the place, when we first opened it in July 2006, the outside temperature was 30 degrees. Staff came in, opened the airlock doors, got the temperature down to 14 degrees, and it stayed between about 14 and 17 degrees from that date to this, without any artificial heating or cooling.
Brilliant.
Our brewery is the facade is a Victorian tower brewery. Behind it sits one of the most technologically advanced breweries in Europe.
Wow.
If you go to a brewing town, you'll see steam coming out of chimneys and heat being vented to the atmosphere. That's all energy being lost. We capture that heat, hold it in a holding tank, and use it to boil the water that's coming through for the next brew.
Fantastic.
When we lightweighted our glass bottle, because with the University of East Anglia, we'd done a full supply chain analysis of that. And that set off something of an arms race, both in the UK, but also when I got off the plane in Oliver Tambo Airport in Johannesburg in 2010, I saw AB InBev were talking about lightweighting their bottle. So it really is a butterfly flutters its wings on the east coast of England, and you can make a tornado happen somewhere else. So the business has always had a sort of leadership position in that space. And, you know, it's been a pleasure working with these enlightened people.
Well, fantastic. And Southwold is on the south coast, where you have your 600 people, or there and thereabouts you have them. Very special. Those who are listening on the different podcast platforms won't see on the YouTube video that you've got some lovely pictures behind you. Do you want to tell us the story? I don't know what the story is, but your 4 pictures you've got.
These are by a children's book author called Chris Wormel. And we did an advertising campaign, and these are the original lino cut designs from an advertising campaign that we did in the mid-2000s, and it was called Beer from the Coast. So there's all sorts of images that have been done in those that also have things like Adnams bottle tops and sails and bottles in them, and it was an iconic campaign.
Yeah.
I'll just correct you on the geography. We are on the east coast of England, and we are about 10 miles south of the most easterly point in England, which is Ness Point in Lower Scotland.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that one. Of course,
So
Norfolk and Suffolk is not on the south coast.
Exactly.
No,
So
not even my bad geography would get me there.
No, we're almost as close to Amsterdam as we are to London.
That's a good little story. I love that one. And of course, the Dutch of Amsterdam and other places have had a huge influence on England's history. Not only did we have one of their kings and William of Orange and all that, but they managed to sink on much of our navy in the Thames. And the East India Company was superseded by the Dutch East India Company, and much of our banking and all our finance in the world was thanks to the Dutch.
Yes, and if you come to this part of the world, and in particular go to Norwich, you'll see a lot of Dutch gable end buildings. And just off of here was the Battle of Solbay, in which the British fought the Dutch in, I think it was the Third Anglo-Dutch War. I think it was a score draw, but we have a product called Broadside, which is linked to that battle that took place, and we have a pub called the Solbay.
Yeah, that's great.
So the history runs in this place.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love it. Well, in all your experiences, you have had, I'm sure, many highs and lows, but a lot of the leaders I talk to have probably learned the most from the mistakes they made or the dark moments they had. Not that I want to get too long in the dark moments, but I think it was Mark Twain who said, I learned so much from my mistakes, a great deal of knowledge I gained from it, that indeed I think I'm going to go make a few more. But aside from mistakes, dark moments, what is a dark moment in your life or your business that you talk about, and what did it teach you?
Well, I think, one needs to keep dark moments in context. I saw my mother fall quite ill when I was a 10-year-old. She had 15, 16 years after that. But by the time I was 26, I'd lost her. And that taught me a lot, because I saw somebody suffering with ill health, and that's quite profound, really. In my business life, there have been times when we've had very difficult challenges here when we've been implementing change. Most recent of those, and these are not for the faint-hearted, is we chose to rip out our old legacy IT systems and put in a new state-of-the-art system. As these things do, that ran over time and it ran over budget, and it caused lots of angst in the organization. And as a leader, you sometimes doubt yourself. Are we doing the right thing here? But that's the time you have to lead. So that's one example of that. There have been times when during my tenure here, there's a lot of things that go on in pubs when alcohol and late at night. I remember having to go to a pub in Norwich where somebody had been killed by someone who waited in the toilet until they were cashing up, then came out, hit them with a bar stool, and then took the money. That was quite a dark moment. So, but it's part of life's rich tapestry, isn't it? That we hopefully gather strength as we go.
Yeah, and I'm really sorry about your mother and that long period of illness that she had. How do you think that's shaped you as the leader you are today? Did you learn anything that was positive to you from that tough time?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I learned a sort of stoicism from my mother. I learned, and I watched my father over that time as well, and I learned from some of his behaviours. He was a person who was struggling with what was going on. I learned how to, get strength from others. I have a brother. We stuck together through that period, but also I built long and enduring friendships, and they have been really, really meaningful. And I'm talking about friendships from when I was 10 years old, and I'm still talking to these people and still friends with them and still meet up with them.
That's special, and it's a bond which you'll never lose. I caught up with a friend of mine, Tony and Roger, I've known since I was 3 and 4, and catching up with them again is very special. And we just got in a couple of weeks' time our 43rd reunion, 43 years on of our platoon at Sandhurst, and I got my best man Errol coming from Jamaica, and another friend, General Himalaya Tapper, coming from Nepal. And then all the rest of us, including Stuart Wright, who used to work at the Norwich Union after his time in the army. So I think it is important to stick together and have some support from family and friends, particularly when you're going through such tough times. And I'm sorry you had to go through that.
Well, it's life. Everybody has, life happens, doesn't it?
Yeah. I think, was it John Lennon said, life is what happens when you're making other plans, and we have to learn from those. And talking of learning from things, what bit of advice do you wish you had when you started out, when you were a young 16, 18-year-old, that you could pass on to others who are listening for themselves or for their children?
I think, a bit like those people that you took away, and they were all very ambitious. I was a very ambitious young man. And I think if someone could have said to me, it's going to be all right, that would have been very helpful. And just those, saying to the sort of 15, 16, 17-year-old self, it's going to be all right, would be very powerful at that time, because I'd also gone through that period with my parents. So there was quite a lot of anxiety around as well, but that was expressing itself in ambition rather than in other ways. So I think that would have been really helpful for me.
It's so interesting you say that, because when I think back to my father was killed when I was 2.5. You can see, but only those on the video can see, that I have my father's naval cap and his naval sword hanging on my back wall in my study here in Lincolnshire. And he was a great influence on me. We had a family reunion, and I met in this village a lovely man, Alan, who was a captain in the Royal Navy. And his father-in-law happened to be my father-in-law's chief engineer, who then had to write the air accident report about the plane crash which killed him. Now, I was always told that my father had got his co-pilot out, which he had, Bill White, Commander Bill White, lived, but that he had ejected and been sent into the tailpiece and it had killed him, but he died instantly. I now understand from a little extract from the air accident report that actually what happened on the Buccaneer was it was poorly manufactured. A fire started one of the turbine engines, which is close to the fuselage, which set off the fuel tank, which blew up, and the whole thing crashed with my father in it. So I'm afraid he didn't get out, and it was grimmer than they wished us to know about. So it's those moments that have a huge impact on us. And it is interesting. I relate to what you've just said, in the fact that I, as a young man, and for many years in my army career, was very ambitious. I felt I had something to prove to somebody long dead, that I was good enough. Or to be worthy of my mother's stoicism, as she tried to get on in life without a husband and with 3 young boys under the age of 9. And I think that would have been good advice to me as well. It's going to be all right, Jonathan. Just, you don't need to work so hard. You don't need to be so intense. Just lighten up a bit. And in fact, our mutual friend Richard Danner did say to me when I was one of his company commanders, Jonathan, just, you can lighten up a bit. Don't be so competitive with your peer group. That would have been good advice if I'd taken that. I sort of partly heard it, but I was still desperately trying to prove myself. And for all those who were affected by my anxiety and desire to try and get on and be the best and all that kind of stuff, I'm sorry if you're listening. I apologize.
Yeah, well, same for me, really. It was a period that we were having this difficulty with my mother. We were moving from London to Norfolk, which was a real upheaval for the family. And for me, it just expressed itself in that way, but also a competitiveness with myself, as you've just said, trying to prove to somebody else, but who is that somebody else, that I'm in somehow worthy of this or whatever.
Oh, it's very interesting, as you and I study the profession of leadership and the tips, and Lee and I, my wife and I, have designed psychometrics about what makes inspiring leaders. And there's one particular psychometric that we use with a lot of our CEOs and their executive teams, and it picks up whether you're competitive or comparative or both. Now, my wife is comparative and I'm competitive and comparative, which is like the worst of all of them. And so what's hilarious is she's got a great personal trainer, and he comes here to our garage, which we've converted into a gym and put glass doors on the front of the garage. And it's a fantastic facility to train in. But she was for some time wary of training with me, because not only would I train with her, but then I'd just try and add in a few more press ups or have a slightly heavier weight. She'd go, "Oh no, stop it! You're making
really quite sad."
Yeah, then she goes, "I'm not going to play." And then she withdrew. She said, "I'm not going to play. If you're going to do that, I will not do it." So now I have to manage it. It's quite funny.
But the comparative piece is really quite interesting as well, because psychologically, if you get into making comparisons with others, that's kryptonite, really. There's always going to be someone who can lift heavier weights, run further, has a more accomplished career. It's kryptonite for the mind. So I've learned over time not to make comparisons.
That is, you're really onto something, which, as I'm sure those listening will have experienced it, if they've either done it themselves or someone's done it to them. I remember a very successful, I won't mention the global bank, but she was in the investment part of a global bank that everybody would know. It's a household name. And we were going through an exercise where she was walking down certain stop points, and I was asking her about her identity and what made her tick and this kind of stuff, just to think about who she was now, and therefore what was her ambition and what would she like to become. A bit of an exercise. And I said, who are you? Your identity, who are you? And she said, "I'm poor." And I love her as a good one, because I knew her base salary was over £1 million, and her bonus had been £500,000. And I laughed, and she went, "No, I'm serious." I said, "Compared to who?" She said, "Well, my boss, he gets 1.4 million, and his bonus was 800,000. I go, "Get real." I said, you're going to be so unhappy all your life. There's always going to be somebody paid more than you.
You're in the top 0.001%.
Yeah. So just whoa, slow it right down. Just don't do that to yourself.
No.
It's not healthy. But I think unwittingly, until somebody else goes, "Smell the coffee, get real. Why are you worrying? Is anybody going to die today?" I mean, I had the CEO of Three Para, Stuart Tootle, who, he had one posthumous Victoria Cross winner, one posthumous George Cross.
Head of security at Barclays for a while.
You have. Well, he's done a podcast with me. Fascinating story. And he indeed introduced me to his old boss, Lord Richards, General Sir David Richards, who will also be coming on the podcast. But the reason I mention him is like, he had so many people 15 were killed, 45 were like life-changing injuries from Iranian-made off-route IEDs that the Afghans had, or from Pakistan, from the ISI. And that puts everything in perspective. And so when someone's go, oh, this is really terrible, I go, has anybody died? I mean, like, is this a life-threatening situation? I know you haven't got promoted or whatever it might be, but please put it in perspective. Now, we don't want to patronize people or indeed belittle or minimize what's going on, but sometimes we do need a good dose of reality.
No, and Edith Eger talks about this in her book, The Gift, which is, one of my favorite books. And she talks a lot, and Gabor Mate talks about this as well, about trauma. And, trauma can happen at all sorts of levels. It can be, I'm not earning as much as I think I'm worth, or, I've lost a parent or a sibling or something. It doesn't matter what the trauma is, it's how it affects that person.
That's very true. Very true. And also it's your value system and how your value system's been transgressed and how it affects you. Some people go, hey, it's not a big thing. But talking of value systems, let's have a chat about that. We'll go around the Inspiring Leadership Compass. I know you teach a whole variety of different models. We've just found this very useful as a way of what makes high-performing leaders and teams. And I get the sense it's really important to you, your moral quotient, your integrity, your values, your beliefs, what you will and what you won't do. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said a gentleman and a lady is someone who knows what they will do and what they won't do. But what did you learn when you let your quite serious values slip, and how did you get back on track?
I have a very strong inner critic. I have a very strong, voice in my head, and that starts telling me early when I'm getting close to that point, and I manage to drag myself back. I have quite a framework within which I work. Having led this organization for a number of years as well, there's a sort of overlap of the sort of organizational values and my own, and it affects me profoundly if I've done something that steps over the line in terms of that moral sort of quotient that one might have. And I'm really quite hard on myself, and I have to practice a bit of loving kindness towards myself.
Yes, the compassion is very important. I wonder if you ever come in your travels, because you're clearly someone who loves to develop. One of the people I interviewed was the managing director of the Hoffman Institute. Have you come across the Hoffman Institute? Look it up. So the Hoffman Institute, I did one of their programs, 7 days, most intense kind of personal training you'll ever do. You're with 23 colleagues. It's deliberately for that number. There's 3 facilitators. It can be broken down into 8 in a subgroup. But you do all the preparation work, about 9 hours of it beforehand, some weeks beforehand, and they check whether you're suitable or not to come on it, about your childhood upbringing. And because you lost your mother, and I mean, as in, it's always my brother Graham who said, our brother David died 2 years ago of metastatic cancer. It was tragic at 63. So we didn't lose David. He's not out there in the garden somewhere. No. Why do we use these American terms, which are so loose? They should actually be much tighter. David died. Face the facts. Let's not talk about someone, they've gone, we've lost them. They died. Yeah. And your mother died, my father died way before their time. That is a factor that you have to come to terms with, which influences, as we just discussed, the patterns of behavior that you and I show later in life, or indeed, certainly the period up to 13. And you, I think, said you were 10 when your mother started to be seriously ill. Is that right?
So that's absolutely right. So that was the traumatic period for me, really. By the time she died, when I was 25, 26, I was conditioned that we were going to lose her, But if you can imagine as a 10-year-old going to bed every night thinking, am I going to see my mum in the morning?
Yeah.
That was the traumatic period for me, that period of years. Now, as I grew older, I became conditioned to it and was able to deal with it more. But I can remember it as vividly as it happened yesterday.
Yeah, and it's no coincidence
that lives with me.
Yeah, and it's no coincidence, if I'm right from what we spoke about before, that your brother joined the army. Did you not?
He did. Yes.
Yeah.
Joined the Navy.
Joined the Navy. And that's not unusual either, particularly when you've got that kind of background. So going to boarding school, loss of a parent, it could have been in any ways through divorce or whatever, but often they die. What else? So other kind of things that affect our patterns of behavior, which are not helping us when we're older.
That's right.
And we need to be aware of them, need to find pattern, aware of understanding why our primary carers behaved as they did.
Yep.
And then find compassion for them and compassion for ourselves, the small inner child that was desperate for love. And it's called negative love. And this deficit of love, that you were desperate for the ongoing love of a mother or of a father who was trying to cope and might have withdrawn into himself in order to get by.
Absolutely. And they were doing their absolute best. And I would not say that I wasn't loved or anything, but there was this other sort of story that was running in the background as well. Those two things overlapped at times, and it was challenging, but it's all part of life's experience that shapes you to be the person that we are today, as it were.
Correct. And what I found, and one of my CEO clients has just recently come back and wrote me a very kind letter thanking me for the life-changing experience of going on the Hoffman process. That it doesn't matter what age you do it at. Some people have done it in their 70s and their 80s, because it's a release of who you can then be. You can take off the masks that you've learned to wear, and certainly in the military, being an army officer, you can imagine, this is the way you dress. You have this blazer and you have a pair of, dark blue or maroon cords or whatever, and a shirt from German Street and a tie from German Street. And that's how you dress when you're not in uniform, because it's another uniform. So there's some fascinating things. Which really takes me on to the next of the 8 components, which is what gives your life meaning and purpose. PQ, as I call it, purpose quotient. What about you, Andy?
Well, I think there is the whole family and friends. That's really important to me, and turning up for them and being present is really, really important. I think professionalism and competence, and being known for someone who does have a set of values and is prepared to stand up for those values has been important for me over time. So that's a sort of lot of sort of complex things there wrapped up in that. But we've got 2 grandchildren now, a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. And it's just the most wonderful experience. It's cliched to say, oh, well, you can always give them back. But I think as a grandparent, you've just got more time, more experience, and more patience with these young human beings. And that's great. Whether they like having their grandfather around or not is a whole different
I'm absolutely sure they do. We have a hilarious time, Lee and I, where Riley, who is now about 14 months old, can't speak, but he has learned to say mama and daddy or dada or something. But he's certainly got into papa. And so papa, he'll say papa wherever he sees me. And Lee will go, nanny, and he'll go, no, papa. And she goes, I do all the work. I get up in the middle of the night to help out. And it's papa, just a guest appearance from papa, and he's the most popular one. So that's quite funny. And as we were recording, my stepson very kindly drove off in his car with grandchild in there rather than interrupting our podcast. I think he's taken him for a drive to the play park. We from purpose, we talked about health. I think we've covered that well, and it's clearly very important to you, and you've got some really good tips and techniques there. Is there an extra one you'd add about health and well-being to those listening that works for you?
Yeah, I mean, Peter, I think it's Peter Attia talks about sleep being the Swiss Army knife of good health, and I think he's right. I've just become more and more acutely aware when I've had a good night's sleep and when I've had a poor night's sleep, and how that impacts on performance the next day. There's no doubt about that.
So true. And I actually even also have the power nap I did before this podcast. Yeah.
Great.
I go and have 40 minutes in bed, of which normally 30 minutes is sleep. And it gives me 2 parts of the day. I have like a start all over again, round about 1 o'clock. Had some good food, and off I go. And it makes a huge difference, particularly because at my age, I get up a few times in the night. Yeah. And that tends to break up the deep and the REM sleep.
Yeah. Well, I'm very envious, but at the moment I occupy an office with lots of glass panels in the door, and lots of people walking past. So if they see me asleep, it might be a bit of a challenge to explain.
No, I think you need to have your little sleep pod, and you need to set it and say, asleep back in 20 minutes.
Back in 20 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's good. You perhaps ought to have a sleep pod in the whole of the place. I think no, don't underestimate it. People, I mean, I remember in the military days, I'll sleep when I'm dead. I get by on 4 hours sleep. I have 3 hours sleep.
Isn't it funny how that became so macho?
Oh, crazy. Absolutely crazy. And doing airborne training, they deliberately wake you up in the, when you think you're going to try and get some sleep. No, it's utter nuts, absolute madness. It's like driving when drunk. You're the same equivalent. You might as well be.
So they say.
Yeah, EQ is the next one round the compass, the Inspiring Leadership Compass. And one of the great skills I find is listening, active listening. You're a good listener. I know this from our conversations, but what's your top tip on listening well, Andy?
Well, I've got an anecdote. I was at Brockley County Grammar School in a place called Lewisham, and my English teacher was Mr. Wardell. You can tell this had left a lasting impression on me. And because in grammar schools, they were aspiring to be something else. You were called by your surname. And he said, Wood, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them in that ratio. And that started. I could have been quite jabberish in the past, but the lady who used to put books on my desk was very good at teaching me to become much more of an active listener, and also, in meetings, actually reading the non-verbal cues as well, really important. So it's just something I'm aware of, because in this role and in leadership roles, you have the extrovert, don't you? And you have the introvert, and the introvert often has most of the best ideas.
Yeah,
and how you get those out is a real challenge, and it's an art.
Yeah, and that's why I love the work of Nancy Klein, the time to think. So Nancy trained up Lee and myself, and we often pass on the tips from her to others, and it's the game changer for many organizations when they start using the thinking environment, and everybody gets their chance to speak without having their thinking assaulted, without someone else speaking over them. And it is the introvert, Susan Cain's book in Quiet, which I'm giving to my my daughter and her husband to be the weekend after next when they get married. And there's a few bits and pieces. I have my bag of show and tell, which is part of my Father the Bride speech, which I did for my other daughter. But there's a completely different bag of goodies. But one of them is her husband is a very thoughtful, very clever man, Cambridge. But works for the FCA, but doesn't say very much. But when he speaks, it's a profoundly either A, very funny and dry, or B, very well thought through. And yeah, there's been this, particularly from the American influence, extroverts are the kings and the introverts are lesser. No, not at all. I find some of the best CEOs I work with are introverts. They've learned to be extroverted, but then at nature, they're introverts.
And just taking that as a stage further, I think for organizational design, we often, people get promoted because they've got more and more people that report to them, and that's the route through. And we talked about a company and a battalion and what have you. But organizations, I think, more and more are going to have to reward technical expertise as well. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they've got a legion of people, but they've got tremendous expertise in their given field. And how do you recognize that and make those people feel valued is really important for organizational design, I think.
Spot on. And in the military, we realized that this was an issue. So some of the technical arms, they had a particular stream for the technical skills, gunnery, signaling, engineering, and that they could get promoted and be paid, but go up a technical stream, which didn't involve so much command and leadership, but we needed their skills. And we always used to slightly joke, but actually it's not that funny, that some people had the abbreviation NANS. I said, well, NANS? What's that? Not allowed near soldiers. Yeah, they're just very good technically, but do not please put them in command of soldiers, because they will mess up their lives and lead them miles in the wrong direction. But I think that's interesting. But talking about soldiery, I was fascinated by the fact that you're a deputy Lord Lieutenant of, is it Norfolk and Suffolk, or just Norfolk? Just Norfolk. Now, how did you get an amazing job like that, Andy? And well, talk about uniform. You're there in your uniform with looking very smart.
I don't know. It's a bit of a black box, I think, Jonathan. So one day, the previous Lord Lieutenant, a fellow called Richard Jewson of Jewson's, the builders merchant, he was Lord Lieutenant of Norfolk before Pippa Dannant. And a letter comes through the letterbox, and you open it up and you just read it. And would you like to be a deputy lieutenant of Norfolk, of which there are a number? So this is not, there are many involved in it, but it's recognition of a sort of civic responsibility. That you've done things that have gone the extra mile
Congratulations. And also you get to, like your brother with his service, you get to wear a very smart uniform. Do you have a hat? Do you have a hat with a plume in it?
You can do, but it would be very rare to see me in anything like that. I'm happy to turn up in a suit and represent Pippa, and indirectly represent the monarch at events that take place in Norfolk.
Well, very nice. And have you met the King?
I have. I was. For the period 2014 to 2016, I was the then Prince of Wales Ambassador for Responsible Business in the East of England.
Yeah. Wow. And was that interesting?
It was very interesting. Clearly, I got to meet the now King, then Prince of Wales, on a number of occasions. And it enabled me to convene one or two things to further responsible business and responsible capitalism in this part of the world in his name. And it was really good. It was really good. And particularly in the sort of environmental space, we were able to do things because that's a passion of His Majesty.
Yeah, no, I think he does a fantastic job. Let's take another one, CQ, which is sort of teams and groups, cultural, collective, cognitive intelligence. How do you get on with people who are very different from you? I mean, in your different roles, you're going to meet people who are very different from you. What's your top tip you'd give?
Absolutely. My top tip is to work hard to try and look at the world through their lens, because they are coming at problems and approaching things, and it's about questioning. It's about asking, why do you see the world in that way? What is making you hold that opinion? That would be my top tip. Try and put yourself in their shoes.
Yeah, no, I like that one. And resilience is the next one. How have you picked yourself up in time of adversity? I'm sure you've had many an occasion.
Yeah.
Your best tip on that?
Well, my best tip is not to consume too much of my own product at such times. But it's been to take myself away. So going out on the bike, trying to do something very, very different, going for a run, it absolutely puts the world into a different place, and the mind, the mind moves to a different place. I also use meditation quite a bit, and that's very good to clear the mind, really. So that's what I try to do, and I find when I've been successful in clearing the mind, ideas for dealing with the problem then come up, because the mind is just not cluttered with all the noise of the problem that you're dealing with.
Yeah, I love that one. It's so true. And the Japanese talk about forest bathing, where you walk in the woods. And excuse me. And I'm going away to do an event for a CEO and his team. We've got a few of them the latter part of this year around the world, but offsites are very useful. And what I mix into the offsites that I do with the executive team and the CEO is that they pair up and they go out into the forests around the lovely venue that we're going to be in this particular case, we're going to be in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. But it's got stunning settings and paths and footpaths, and just to slowly amble around on a walk with a colleague, one of you talking and the other one really listening well. And when you come back, that you have to summarize what you heard the other colleagues say, so that you don't take notes. You just have to really listen well. Brand, reputation, image, and impact is the next one, the BQ, the penultimate one. I imagine, particularly with you teaching leadership, that you are hopefully a fan of 360 feedback rather than living in a happy illusion that you're wonderful in every sense. What have you learned from, if there was one thing that you've learned from the value of 360 feedback, what is it you've learned?
I think that you can't communicate enough, that you often think you've communicated clearly and succinctly, but just as you were saying and you were describing in that walk in the forest and listening intently, people have often got other things going on in their minds. So I think you can't communicate enough, really. That was one of the first things I would take away. The second is not to be too managerial. Actually allow some of your own vulnerabilities to come through.
Yeah.
I think that's important.
That is the thing, time and again, that I weave into the offsites, because there may be low levels of trust, and the leaders feel they have to put the mask on and be invulnerable and be the smartest man in the room, the cleverest woman, whatever it might be. And actually, where they gain the greatest respect is where they say things like, do you know what? I don't know, but let's find out. What do you think? Yeah. And as soon as someone comes with a problem, to use dialogue, where you go, how about we go 2 minutes each way? You begin. Let me ask you your own question back. What do you think you should do about this? Yeah. And then at least you can get up to speed with what they're talking about, because often a leader blurts out an answer for somebody, but they don't know what the person's been working on for the last 6 weeks. Yeah. And when they actually then explain what they think they should do, you go, oh, it's a completely different angle. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. But I think that takes some experience and some confidence to be able to do that and own up to not having all the answers, and to recognize that the leader doesn't have the franchise on good ideas.
Yeah, spot on.
But you have to, you kind of need to create a trusting environment for that to be able to happen. And I think trust is really important in this equation as well.
Yeah. So, and trust equals speed times cost, as Covey said,
Yeah.
Top tip on legacy. How would you encourage people to work out what their legacy should be?
I'm a bit, I'm not too worried about it, to be perfectly honest. I think you are wandering into the realms of ego. I think it's for others to decide what one's legacy is. I'm a great believer that organizations are amoeba-like. When someone leaves, there's a hole for a few moments, but then it closes over and the train moves on. So I'd like to think I'm fairly low ego, so therefore what my legacy is, I think that's for others to decide, Jonathan, to be
nice touch. I like that one. The last three questions about executive teams and your favorite book, and then the top tip. If you were to give a tip to people about dealing with a toxic individual or a toxic team, in a nutshell, what would be your top tip?
I think you have got to be seen to have clarity, consistency, and a calmness when dealing with such people. And you've got to make sure you're fair to all. I see in organizations, and have seen in organizations, managers, leaders, directors shy away from dealing with difficult people. You know, we've got in the stories of whistleblowing. You know, as we're doing this podcast, there's been this story of this nurse, and you know, organizations have got to be seen to deal with people who are not doing the right thing. And that is one of the ultimate roles of the leader.
Brilliant. No, I completely agree. Thank you. Great advice. Penultimate question: your favorite book and why people should read it or listen to it?
So I first came across Edith Eger, I think it would have been in a conversation with Rangan Chatterjee. And she has written a number of books, one being called The Gift, and the subtext of that is 21 ways to save your life, I think. This is a 93-year-old, retrained as a psychologist when she got to America, Holocaust survivor, saw her mother and father taken off to the gas chamber, was made to dance for one of the camp commandants. I mean, a horrible story, but a wonderful story in the power of her mind and framing things and seeing the world differently. And I would recommend it. It's not a very long read, and you know, it's almost a book that you can read at one sitting.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. So, Andy, if you'd end with your top tip, please just introduce yourself, talk about the role you have and what your top tip is.
So I'm Andy Wood. I'm Chief Executive of Adnams, a brewery in Suffolk in the UK. My top tip, and when I'm in meetings, there's often teacups on the table, and it's teacup, which is think clearly under pressure and find tools and techniques that can enable you to do that.
Fantastic. Well, look, Andy, we're very lucky to have had you on this podcast. Thank you. I'm very grateful for the advice that Doug Field said, need to have him. He's my recommended guest. He was spot on. And you clearly love the topic as well as the practice of leadership. So thank you very much indeed.
Jonathan, it's an absolute pleasure. Really enjoyed our conversation. Thank you.